He is presumed innocent unless until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. We have agreed, though, by our agreement that she will not be sentenced until after all trials are completed. You heard the judge say that could be 6 months from now, that could be 2 years from now. We really don't know. She is to appear in the future periodically through reviews. The court has allowed her to do that by phone in those reviews until such time as we get up towards sentencing on her particular case. She did read into the record a factual basis, which is also required by Colorado law. I do have a copy of that, but I assume you've all got that on camera, and I don't necessarily need to repeat that. The judge put certain terms of the agreement on the record, such as she is required to cooperate in all cases. She is required to testify if called upon to testify in all cases. And in particular, obviously, he referenced the FRAZEE case that is currently set for February 19th for preliminary hearing at 9 o'clock. She is not allowed to talk to the press. That is actually part of our agreement, that she is not allowed to do that. So she will be making no comments at all to the press, or it'll be a violation of that agreement.
Listening. Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. This is day 4 in the FRAZEE criminal trial. Right now it is exactly 9:30 in Colorado, and obviously there's kind of an embargo on live tweeting from the court building, so we don't know what is happening, and we will only know intermittently what is happening. I've got a gut feel, and I could certainly be wrong in saying this, but I've got a feeling that today is going to be quite a big day. There was talk of witnesses, or a witness coming from out of town to testify. Also caught Carol McKinley tweeting about expecting an explosive court day today. My sort of criminal, my true crime antenna are sort of blinking a little bit, and I suspect that today may be the day that we hear from Krystal Kenney, the mistress, sort of at the center of this whole case. And I think it sort of makes sense that she would be given her own day to testify. We've seen a lot of other witnesses prior, I think more than 20. I think on one day there were 14, on another day 11. And I think today will be devoted to the prosecution's star witness. They've spent quite a lot of time sort of detailing their timeline, and now they're going to be bringing in, I believe, Kenny. Now the order is quite interesting. I remember in the Triple X murder case of Henry Van Breda in South Africa, we call them an accused over here. In America it's the defendant. In any event, the defendant elected to testify second, in other words after all the defense witnesses, the experts and so on. And this is not really protocol. Usually you have the defendant going first, and then the experts testify afterwards, and one sort of expects, if you have a good defense, one expects them to corroborate one another. Obviously when there's any contradiction, then it doesn't work very well. In this situation you now have a similar scenario where kind of the same sort of thing is happening, potentially, where a lot of the experts have come before, they've established issues of timeline, and now that those have been sort of carved in stone, now the groundwork has been laid for Kenny to have a platform, and she's probably been made cognizant of certain issues of fact and certain issues of time, and also the preliminary objections of the prosecution, of the defense. And so obviously Kenny has a sort of incentive. If she doesn't provide good testimony, she could serve 3 years in jail. So she needs to deliver, and I think this is part of that strategy, is having her testify after most of the important witnesses. I could be wrong. She may not be testifying right now. It might be some other witnesses. Maybe we're going to be hearing from the cadaver dog handlers. Maybe we're going to hear from fingerprint experts, people used to searching for human remains, scientists, forensic experts, and so on. But I've got a feeling it's going to be the mistress. So obviously I'm kind of providing this message in the blind. It's 9:30. There's been no reporting from the court thus far. It does look like a sort of a partly cloudy day there, quite a sunny day, but cold. While I'm here, I will do a part 2 to this particular episode, but while I'm here, I just want to sort of go through a couple of things that I've been thinking about, and just put them out there before we sort of recap what happens when we know what's happened. In the previous episode, we touched on what one learns from intertextuality. Now, you as a prosecutor or a law enforcement or a true crime writer, you will use true crime intertextuality to try to figure out a criminal and to figure out how he thinks the same. But there's also the intertextual element within the crime, which is criminal intertextuality. So where the criminal himself is using what he knows about other criminal scenarios to try to leverage his situation. And so two obvious examples of that, two obvious applications are possibly that unlike Watts, FRAZEE lawyered up immediately. So if FRAZEE took any notice of the Watts case, then it would make sense that the biggest lesson to be learned from someone in a similar position is don't talk to the police at all. Lawyer up, have all your communications through a lawyer. And that is exactly what FRAZEE did. It's like chalk and cheese between Chris Watts and FRAZEE in this respect. And so it's either a coincidence or FRAZEE certainly did kind of learn his lessons through what we saw with Chris Watts. Then something else that is also very interesting is FRAZEE has given no media interviews whatsoever. So we saw the sermon on the porch with Chris Watts. We saw what a disaster that was for him. If you're arrogant enough to commit a crime, you're arrogant enough to try to talk your way out of it. And FRAZEE didn't fall into that pothole either. And one wonders again whether he learned that lesson directly from Chris Watts, or whether one can also argue that it's just part of his nature, that he's not the kind of guy who'd want to speak to anyone or whatever. I don't get that impression. I get the impression he's a reactionary, angry sort of fellow, and that he would want to talk to the police and he would want to give interviews, but clearly he's also smart enough to know better than certainly what Watts did. A couple of other things that are bothering me and that are worth thinking about at this early stage. What happened to the murder weapon? The murder weapon was apparently a aluminum baseball bat. Where is it? What happened to it? Then if we do hear from Krystal Kenney, we'll likely hear some detail about her cleaning up the crime scene 2 days later. So she was basically what's the word? She was essentially called up to the scene 2 days later, so presumably on November the 24th, and when she arrived, she cleaned up the scene, according to her, according to what she said, for 3 to 4 hours. So I suspect that if FRAZEE was involved, there would have still been some cleaning up of the scene in terms of what one could see through the window. What sort of obvious traces would probably have been cleaned up and obvious evidence destroyed. I think it was Kenny's job to clean up the rest, and there was a lot to clean up. There was obviously a lot of blood and a lot of destruction of human tissue and injury. But yeah, something that is certainly hard to stomach and hard to believe is immediately after the cleanup operation, Kenny apparently went to get a hamburger. So after cleaning up blood and being in this crime scene where someone had died, she went straight from there to Sonic Hamburger and had her hamburger. Then two other aspects I want to highlight is there's a black box and a black tote. They're not the same thing. The black box is apparently quite a large container in the back of FRAZEE's pickup truck, which apparently moved at different times, and so part of the speculation is were Kelsey's remains placed in this black box. Then there's also talk of a black tote. It's really frustrating not to be able to see either of these. It's difficult to imagine what is the significance of the black tote unless was it a big enough bag to put in body parts or whatever it was. Was it big enough for that? But I think one thing that is significant is that they were both black. The black tote is something that is implicated in this crime, and anything black is not going to stain red very easily. Still, it would be good to know how big this black tote was. If you Google tote bags, they don't look particularly big. They're sort of fairly small, open bags at the top with biggish straps. People often shop with them. They're almost like slightly larger than handbags. But one can't really imagine that it was used for a lot of human remains, unless the human remains were altered in some way. So yeah, in terms of the black box, it was reoriented. So at one point one can see it facing one way at 136. I think that's in the ATM camera, and at another point it's facing a different direction at 4:36. So 3 hours later, and so the questions around that: why did it move? I've seen some people reporting that it was the black tote that moved, but it's the big black box in the back of the pickup that moved. Something else I want to point out: Sean FRAZEE, according to Sam Kramer, didn't look like he wanted to be in court when he testified yesterday. His answers were short. He didn't seem to have much to say. He didn't seem to want to say anything. And then a final few aspects just to raise in terms of the timeline. He called his mother at 4:30 that afternoon. He was hours late for the Thanksgiving meal. In fact, he missed the Thanksgiving meal. His brother said that he arrived home at 5 o'clock. He was last seen on surveillance camera at 4 o'clock, and if you look at a map of the area, it looks like the distance from Kelsey's home to FRAZEE's home wasn't much more than 20 minutes. It was around about 15 miles and 18 to 20 minutes drive. So why would it have taken him an hour to drive that distance? Well, one possibility is that he needed to do something to the remains if he had them. Bury them, burn them, dispose of them somewhere, hide them, whatever it is, drive them somewhere else. It's also interesting that after he got home, he ran errands. So he's sort of not home the whole day, arrives home for Thanksgiving, makes sort of a quick appearance, and then he disappears again. So none of that, it doesn't seem very reasonable. It seems a bit weird. And then something just to raise very quickly is the early scenario is that Kenny was solicited on 3 occasions to commit murder. The first one was poisoning Kelsey's coffee. I think it was a caramel macchiato or something like that, and the idea she had was to put a cocktail of Ambien and I think Xanax in it. And what's possible is, although Kenny denies that she went through with it, what's possible is that she actually did go through with it, and it was a failed attempt. In other words, it was a botched attempted murder. It was a botched attempt, and that's just an early theory. It's very difficult to say either way. We don't know how she reacted after that, if she sent any text saying that she felt tired or whatever. But I just think that's a possibility. The idea that if she went to the trouble to go to her home with a coffee, really would Kelsey not have drunk it? Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. I'm just saying it is possible that she did drink it, and the anticipated death overdose didn't actually happen. So I think that is worth bearing in mind. She's also claimed that she purposefully left behind telltale evidence. I don't know if I believe that. She was sent there to clean up the crime scene. She did clean up the crime scene, and I don't think she purposefully left behind telltale evidence. That is also minimizing her role in the whole thing. So one is going to need to treat the testimony of this star witness for the prosecution with one's going to need to be critical of it and be careful with it. And that concludes the first part of the coverage. The next part will deal with a recap of the events of the day. Before we get there, if you've been enjoying this content, please subscribe, leave a comment, like, and let's continue with the rest of the day's session, day 4. So at around about 11 o'clock local time, we had the first reports from court from Sam Kramer, noting that Kevin Hoyland, should be a familiar name to folks familiar with the Chris Watts case, an FBI expert on cell phones. He'd been the sole witness in the first session in the morning, and according to Kramer, and I quote, he said he provided an insane amount of detail, end quote, showing how the handsets of Kelsey and Patrick FRAZEE were used kind of in concert. And you'd expect that kind of detail with this kind of witness. His job is to extract data, it is to filter data, it is to analyze data, it is to make sense of all the detail. So you would expect a lot of detail, probably GPS coordinates, a lot of traffic, a lot of cell phone messages, whether it's calls incoming, tower pings, that sort of thing. And so it was Kevin Hoyland who sort of went through that. I would have loved to have caught that. but the basic theme of the message was that even though Kelsey had died, her phone was still with Patrick FRAZEE. And this seems to be a critical error that he made. No matter what he did otherwise, the fact that Kelsey's phone was with him is pretty damning. I mean, how is there an innocent explanation for something like that? So it'll be interesting to see what the defense come up with. It will definitely be difficult for the jury to put that thought aside. I mean, how often do you carry around someone else's phone for any length of time? I actually did it today. I sort of heard some messages on a friend's phone, and then I gave the phone to this person, and you don't tend to have someone's phone for hours, let alone days, right? And according to Jacob Rogers from the Gazette, who was also reporting, he said that Hoyland said that the handsets were together for at least 24 hours. That's quite a long time. And that they traveled between Florissant, that's FRAZEE's ranch southwest of Triple Creek, to the Westcliff area, and then back to Florissant. Now, we need to speculate on the significance of that. You know, why would the phone have traveled south to the Westcliff area? Does that have something to do with the disposal of remains? Does it have something to do with meeting Kenny? Maybe she can provide insight into that. And then what was also very interesting was seeing the cell phone tower data from Kenny's phone, showing her phone traveling from Idaho on the 23rd, the day after Kelsey's disappearance. She's immediately on the move. She leaves Idaho on the 23rd. It's quite a long way. She's obviously traveling by car. She arrives on the 24th, and then later returns on the 24th to Idaho, arriving on the 25th. That trip alone is very significant. If Kenny wasn't a star witness, it would be very damning. The fact that she traveled then in the direction that she did, and then all the way back again, very, very significant. And then according to Jacob Rogers from the Gazette, he also mentioned cell phone records showing calls between FRAZEE and Kenny the beginning of Thanksgiving evening and into the next day. And one would assume that these calls were to let Kenny know what had happened to Kelsey, and to summon her to the scene. And FRAZEE, it appears, looked like he, if he was involved, it looks like he would have needed someone else at that point to conceal his involvement and to start the whole process of misleading, concealing, covering up, distracting, misdirecting, and all that. And this is where Kenny sort of formed part of the picture. The question was, if that's true, why would Kenny be such a willing participant? And then we move on to a tweet by Ashley Franco, and she provided, even in this sort of very simple tweet, she provided a very important glimpse into what was going on in the court. She simply said that attorneys were meeting privately about privacy concerns for an upcoming witness. And although that could have meant anyone, if you had a little bit of true crime true crime knowledge, acumen, then you would know what that was all about. And so I was one of the first to sort of tweet that I thought that this had to be about Krystal Kenney, not just in terms of the privacy aspect, but this was the perfect juncture in the trial narrative to bring her in from the prosecution's perspective. It was the perfect. The narrative had been set up to a certain point, and now required someone to sort of take over that narrative. And so I tweeted that, and then that was quickly followed by some other people suggesting the same thing. And then Carol McKinley actually quickly filed a report with ABC saying that a star witness was expected. This was before she appeared. And I actually tweeted Carol McKinley directly, asking her whether she thought that it was this was all about Krystal Kenney, and McKinley didn't reply. And then Jacob Rogers tweeted that and this was a lot later. Jacob Rogers from the Gazette tweeted after the mid-morning session, after Hoyland's testimony, at about lunchtime, at about 12:10, he tweeted a couple of tweets confirming that Kenney was now on the stand, and there wasn't any mention of what was done to address her privacy amongst the media, but in any event, Rogers started covering what appears to be Kenney's backstory with FRAZEE. In other words, how they met, what was the sort of drama going on between them, kind of sometime in the past, I think going back to 2016. So 2 years prior to Kelsey's disappearance, 2 years prior to, and basically a year prior to Kelsey herself falling pregnant. So you sort of have a bit of a sad story. You get the story of this nurse from Idaho who said that, and I quote, "I began thinking I made the wrong choice by getting married," end quote. And this is what Kenney said. Is obviously pretty emotionally charged testimony. And it seems as if she sort of got married and then she met FRAZEE, and she was sort of surprised that she had a sort of a giddy feeling when she was around him, prior to being married, and when she was around him after being married, that same giddy feeling she had, and that made her think that getting married in the first place was a mistake. And so she's obviously quite taken with FRAZEE, and she ended up having an affair with him, and he urged her to get a divorce. And this brings us to the tweet of the day. If you've got any other suggestions, please tweet me at Crime Rocket on Twitter. But my tweet of the day is also from Jacob Rogers from the Gazette, and it's this tweet. In March 2016, Lee became pregnant with FRAZEE's child, and apparently FRAZEE did not react happily to the news, according to Kenney. He said something quite strange. He said, "I guess you're a baby killer or you're not," which is a very odd way to respond to the news of the pregnancy. And it seems as if even then he was basically saying, well, I guess you're going to have an abortion or you aren't. And it's unfortunate that we don't have the full story here about that particular interaction, but in the end, Kenney had an abortion, and according to her, she told FRAZEE it was a miscarriage. Kenney then filed for divorce from her husband 2 months later. Now, bear in mind, she is having an affair with FRAZEE while she's married. FRAZEE's not happy about the pregnancy, but this nevertheless causes her to have an abortion, and then she files for divorce. And then it's sort of like, am I going to be with you now? I've left my husband. I've lost my child. I've lost our child. Are we now going to get together? And you can see that Kenney had basically given up a lot already at this point, and this was obviously when it says that she filed for divorce 2 months later, it's not clear whether that was in May 2016 or whether it was after the abortions. Not completely clear when that was. My gut feeling says that that FRAZEE knew that it was an abortion, that he wanted an abortion, and that Kenny's not being completely honest about telling him it was a miscarriage. I think she's minimizing that aspect in terms of herself and him. I could be wrong. It would be interesting to hear what other women say about this, whether they, if they have had an abortion, whether they would also tell those around them it was a miscarriage, including the father. But this is particularly interesting in terms of the Watts case. You can imagine if Chris Watts had been quite adamant that he wasn't happy about the third pregnancy, and then what would have happened ultimately there. What if Shanann had miscarried? Was she prepared to have an abortion herself? And if she had, what would have been the ultimate result? Would they have filed for divorce? What would have happened in terms of the affair that was going on there? Would that have ultimately worked? Because what we see here is that Kenny didn't seem to ultimately be sort of the recipient of FRAZEE's affections after she got divorced. There was another person, and that brings us to the whole issue of Kelsey Bereth, and was Kenny aware of her? So there was then a falling out apparently between the couple, where they apparently didn't talk until October 2017, which is quite a long time, and then apparently they reconnected during a visit, and then from October until June 2018, and June 2018 is where FRAZEE's payments, custody payments, stopped to Kelsey. That was when FRAZEE never mentioned being in another relationship, or even having a child of his own with Kenny. Now that could mean either that he cared enough about Kenny that he wanted to keep his relationship with Kelsey a secret, or Kenny did know that he was in a relationship with Kelsey. And again, this is difficult to know, thin slicing with very little information, but it seems rational to believe that Kenny did know about Kelsey, because if she didn't, if FRAZEE told her sort of at the last moment and then asked her to kill her or to clean up remains, it would have been a shock to Kenny to realize that, wow, he was involved in another relationship and he'd had a child. That would have been quite a shocking thing. But if she'd known it for some time, then resentment would have built, jealousy would have built, and the sort of mechanism for how one becomes an accessory. That happens over time. There's got to be a lock-in in some way. There's got to be some emotional dependence. There's got to be some significant amount of trust formed during this period with the parties. And obviously her falling pregnant with FRAZEE's child, I'm talking about Kenny, had cemented a kind of a bond between them, certainly in Kenny's heart and in her mind. Interestingly, you have the one journalist, a male journalist, giving the information, and then you have another journalist, in this case Ashley Franco, referring to the same testimony about the abortion, and she states that Kenny is saying this through tears, and so obviously it was traumatic for her, losing her child, getting an abortion. And whether it's true or not, whether she told FRAZEE or not, her own story presents a sort of a scenario where she's going through this traumatic event on her own. She tells him she's having a miscarriage. If she's holding that burden of having an abortion, of purposefully ending the life of her child, also ending her marriage. It's some of the biggest traumas that one can go through, and in a weird way she did it to herself, and in a very real way, I think in her mind and in her heart, FRAZEE must have emerged as sort of the key to both her unhappiness but also to resolving it, possibly a key to her finding her happily ever after ultimately as well. But based on that same hinge, FRAZEE, I think, felt like he had the power to use it to his own advantage. And isn't that what happened? And this brings us to the last tweet for the prior to lunch session. It's just another one from the Gazette's Jacob Rogers. He simply talks about Krystal Kenney's testimony resuming after 1 o'clock. And that's where I'm going to sort of leave off today's coverage. I wanted to get it in fairly quickly. I will do a recap of the afternoon session, which will likely be all about Krystal Kenney as a separate review. I won't do it as a trial day review. I'll do it as a separate review, and then I will see you guys when I do that one, and then I will also see you guys when we go through trial day 5. The trial is certainly gaining momentum rapidly now, and I think a lot of shocking twists and turns are in store for all of us. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Listening.